Seems like most people have sat down now. Well done for keeping going on this rather humid day. I have got all the windows open here. It is a bit hot actually, isn't it? There is a water cooler at the back if anyone wants to avail themselves of that. Could do with a few fans actually, couldn't we? But anyhow, let's get on with it. So let's just make sure you're all here to hear a talk about archaeology. Is that right? You haven't got confused and think it's computational mathematics or evidence-based healthcare or something. Okay, jolly good. They all come into archaeology, by the way. You might be surprised to hear. We do a lot of healthcare in archaeology, mainly on dead people, but some of whom have been dead for a very long time. But let me introduce myself. My name's David Griffiths, and I'm the Director of Studies in Archaeology here at the Department for Continuing Education. So that means that I have a small team of colleagues, and we oversee quite a big archaeology programme that covers an awful lot of themes, ideas and types of award and qualification. We've got this buzzword award, which you've probably heard today. Doesn't mean something that you hand out to kids all wrapped up in gold paper. It's just another name for a qualification, and we run several different levels of those here at the department. I'll come to what we do a bit later on towards the end, so I don't bore you rigid with levels of credit and types of qualification, and then maybe you could ask me some questions at the end of it all. But I suppose the main point of my presence here today is to try to get over to you. I'm sure many of you already have an enthusiasm for archaeology, probably as big as mine is, but I've been working in archaeology in one form or another really since I left school, which was in the early 1980s, so it's quite a long time ago now. And I just sometimes have to sit there and wonder why I've spent my life doing this strange thing, which not many people do, but is actually incredibly stimulating and absorbing as a pursuit and as a profession. And I think it goes back to the days when I suppose I was inspired by fiction as a young kid, by books maybe not entirely factually accurate about the distant past, about prehistory, certain authors like Rosemary Sutcliffe or Henry Treece, and at one remove Tolkien and all that kind of thing, the fantasy side that's based ultimately on, in the case of Tolkien, an understanding of Anglo-Saxon history. I was also inspired by those broadcasts we used to have, often in black and white, showing Carnarvon Castle or the Tower of London. I'm sure those of you who are perhaps my age or older would remember those. And they seem very clunky now compared to modern media, but I found them very inspiring. And I went round as best I could with reasonably tolerant parents to visit a lot of these archaeological sites as a kid. I particularly loved the medieval castles of North Wales, which was not too far away from where I grew up. I just got something that I've never lost. I was captured, not just by the past, because that comes in various different forms, and it's possible to study the past without being an archaeologist, of course. But the thing about archaeology was the encounter with the physical remains of the past, the ability to walk amongst it, to see it, to measure it, and to kind of imagine what had gone on there when this structure was created and subsequently. And that, I think, was the big thing that I got from this kind of early experience. I went on a dig as a sixth former. I was just larking around, really, to be honest. I wasn't that serious about it to start with. And it was at an Iron Age hill fort in the Cotswolds called Crickley Hill. Anyone heard of Crickley Hill? Yeah, a couple of nods. It's a rather splendid place. It sticks out from the Cotswold escarpment over the Vale of Gloucester. It's a very prominent part of the landscape. And in fact, within the Iron Age ramparts that we knew existed, we discovered a Neolithic camp with evidence of a battle. And that battle was evident because a bank, which had been dated by radiocarbon to the Neolithic period, had been burnt. And all along the outside of it, facing inwards, was a whole load of burnt flint arrowheads that had been shot into the earthen stone structure. And that, to me, that was an event that happened unconscionably long ago in the Neolithic, so that's approximately 4,500 to 5,000 years before the present. And yet, the sort of episode of something that probably happened in half an hour, or even less, was there for us to see as archaeologists and to sort of think our way through what that could possibly have meant. And so I just got interested in the idea of being able to piece together the past from quite disparate bits of evidence. And it's not always that clear what you're looking at, really. Part of the thing that archaeologists have to have is I'm not allowed to say this anymore because apparently it discriminates against visually impaired people, but you have to have a good eye for it. And that also means you have to have good touch and other senses. And that was what I was told as a student. You have to somehow be able to piece things together and think about it in a way which we put into our training and teaching here. We like to get people thinking in a kind of forensic way about the past. To be able to read evidence from a micro speck of evidence, something that would be visible in an electron microscope, up to the scale of an entire landscape. It's all archaeological evidence. I'm sure we've all at some point got out of the car, perhaps on a prominent part of a drive around the country, and looked out across an amazing carpet fields with hills in the distance, exactly in fact as you can do from Crickley Hill or anywhere really in the Chilterns or wherever you prefer. And that landscape that really is an enormously complex product of human endeavour over a very long time. It's not natural in the sense that it's not how it was before humans came along, but it's very much a product of ongoing change. And that's what we try to understand as archaeologists in the biggest sense, and I'll come back to that. But probably one of the most obvious, is that going to, why that's not displaying. Let me see if I can. Reload it. Sorry about this. Something's gone a little bit awry with the computer. I'm going to have to try again. Well, there we go. Let's hope, just pray it works. Archaeology is a lot of it's about solving problems as you go along. So these are the kind of classic archaeological images that any member of the public would understand and relate to. I'm sure you all know where they are. So I probably don't need to ask where the one on the top left is. I guess a lot of us have been there, have we? I certainly have twice. Where's this? A bit more difficult to tell where that is, but Machu Picchu, yeah, great city in the Andes. That's obviously the Parthenon in the Acropolis at Athens. And that introduces lots of ethical issues as well to us, because one thing as archaeologists we do is we're not just here to map, document and measure the past. We're here to deal with a lot of the ethical dilemmas that the past throws up. And this has obviously got a very famous one with the Elgin marbles, which were taken from it in the early 19th century and are now in the British Museum. I'm sure you're all aware of this controversy. It's a good one to kick off a course with, because people tend to come with quite entrenched views about this, and we debate it, which we haven't got time to do today, and then over the course of that session quite a lot of people change their mind. It's quite interesting actually, in both directions. So that's good, because in teaching we're not just downloading information. You can get that from books and websites. We're trying to encourage you, as I said before, to see and think and write in a critical way, and to develop your own kind of sense of how to analyse the material and evidence that we have. What's the fourth one? Obviously, Stonehenge, another great site of the past, of course, one that's relatively local to here. And also, I mean, these all have various dimensions about them which encourage critical thought. But this is currently the subject, obviously, of a major planning dispute associated with the A303 road, and opinions all divided about that. Yes?
I've added my grain of salt to that one.
Have you?
I wrote.
Oh, you wrote to them. Are you in favour of the road or not?
I'm not in favour of that road because I think it's a landmark that should be seen by everybody, and every
Yes.
time I go past, it draws me in.
Absolutely, I agree with that. I think the view of it as you going west along the A303 from the Countess roundabout is stupendous, and would have been seen for many hundreds of years like that. But the road is a problem, and the noise is a problem. But then, of course, we live in the modern world, don't we? We can't ever make this a Bronze Age landscape again. Wouldn't last very long, would it? The first person you saw with a mobile phone or the first aeroplane crossing the sky would muck up the Bronze Age feel of the place. There are various solutions which I won't go into, but the profession, as well as the archaeological profession, as well as the public, are very divided about this. Some people who work for organisations that are connected to the road development are in favour of it. It will bring a lot of work to archaeologists, as we'll see in a minute. I've got another slide that addresses this point. But on the other hand, the creation of the road will involve a massive destructive path very close to Stonehenge. And it really is an interesting dilemma, and one which I think there's no particularly convenient answer to be honest. Oh, PowerPoint's working now. So again, these are such slightly jokey slides. Do want at this point of the day to try to get a smile out of you if I possibly can, because we like to think as archaeologists we have a fairly good time together. It's a very sociable discipline. The groups that we teach all tend to gel very much as friends, and they get involved in fieldwork together or going to museums, and it really does, cut across the old social isolation point. We like to think historians, who are our kind of sister discipline, are rather isolationist, a bit quiet compared to archaeologists. But most people will have come across archaeology actually through the media. As I said, I did, some years ago, obviously, but more recent generations have had the same, or perhaps even greater exposure. There's the Hollywood variety of archaeology, which I think touches on reality in some tiny way, but otherwise is pure fantasy. But nonetheless, has actually, be surprised that some people who want to be archaeologists did actually start thinking that when they watched Indiana Jones. Or Tomb Raider or any of those things, and that's really the ultra glamorous end of what archaeology can be, the drama, the adventure, and the sort of glitz. Mick Aston, the late and very dearly beloved guy who used to teach here at one stage of his career actually, and helped to develop our archaeology courses here at Ruby House back in the 70s. He's sort of the other end of the spectrum from Harrison Ford, isn't he, really? But I think made a wonderful contribution in a different way. He was a genuine academic archaeologist who worked in a continuing education department, both here and in the University of Bristol, and was really passionately committed. It was his life's work to take archaeology out to the broader public, to democratise archaeology. Because before people like Mick Aston came along, and they're some of his friends in Time Team down there, archaeology really was a bit dusty. There were some very sort of high-up professors, all of whom are wonderful scholars, but they mainly spoke to each other in closed circuits of university discourse, and occasionally their findings would leak out into the media. But going back to the 1930s, which is really sort of a staging post in the development of modern archaeology, archaeologists used to put hoardings up around their sites to stop the public looking in. And this happened at Avebury when Alexander Keeler, the great sort of marmalade millionaire as he was known, financed a series of excavations. And that's how it was done in those days. And the today's attitude is completely the other way around. That we, following Mick's example, but in all sorts of ways, we are as keen as we can be to get everybody to engage with archaeology, to make it meaningful, to everybody in society, because without what might be described as a popular mandate, without having a kind of feeling of support within general society, the subject is pretty much doomed, actually, because we do something that probably a lot of people would see as unnecessary. It gets in the way of housing developments, it slows down road schemes, it contributes to the costs of things like HS2, which is currently ballooning out of control, but there's been quite a bit of archaeological work on that already. Some of my friends work for it. And the reason that we have archaeologists out there working in these situations is because as a society, we currently value the past enough to permit that. If it ever got to the stage where the general public, you know, the sort of focus groups that inform politicians' decisions had really gone against the past and didn't think ancient monuments or museums or excavations were at all worth having, then we'd be in a bit of a pickle really as a profession. And so by taking it out to the population to make things interesting, make it accessible, get your children in, get them interested, have wonderful open days, have nights at the museum where people sleep over, sleeping bags, have community projects where members of local groups can contribute to the steering and the discoveries going on. All of these myriad of activities that archaeologists are constantly trying to sort of do and do more of, really does help to lift the standing of the past within the general population. And that is a really key aspect of what archaeologists are here for. We study for our own fulfilment, but we're also here as sort of messengers really to take that important message out. And people like Alice Roberts is the latest kind of generation of television presenters who are making scientific learning accessible. Not everything they say on these programs is quite as you would wish it to be. Sometimes it's a bit turned into a sort of journalistic version. But nonetheless, if archaeology is in a newspaper, even heaven forfend a kind of more populist kind of newspaper, then it's taking up space that some other issue might or might not take up, and it's bringing it to the general public, and that's, I think, important. And people are fascinated. Those hoardings were put up to keep people away because people wanted to see what was going on. I did an excavation recently on a medieval ecclesiastical site in East Oxford. I'll refer to it a bit later on. It was a leper hospital founded in the 12th century called Bartlemas Chapel. Anyone know where that is? Yeah. We're just finishing the write-up of that at the moment. It's a wonderful little oasis of beautiful buildings right up a lane off Cowley Road in the middle of quite a busy area. And we did discover a whole series of inhumations and dead bodies. And the Church of England, which gave us the permission to dig there, we had good reasons for digging there, said that the skeletons had to be kept from anyone under 16. It was too upsetting for the children to see skeletons being excavated. And the first school group we had up the lane, the first thing they all screamed at was, "Where are the skeletons?" They were desperate to see these skeletons. And in fact, we did let them see it. So sorry about that. Slightly broke the rules there. But I hope that in so doing, those kids got a flavour of what inspired me as a kid and maybe inspired you. So these are the guises under which archaeologists have been seen by the general public, and we deal with this stuff all the time. Occasionally we're seen as treasure hunters. People come along and say, "Oh, you're digging up treasure so you can claim the reward." Well, no, we generally don't do that. But most archaeologists, we work with metal detectorists. There's a good or an improving relationship with metal detectorists in the wider world at the moment, especially in England. We have something called the Portable Antiquities Scheme, where metal detectorists report their finds, and there's a local liaison officer who helps them identify it. And there's a lot that's been gained from metal detecting. And we work with the metal detecting groups productively now, and that was a wonderful series if you watched it. Because one thing they very subtly did, which I really strongly approved of, was that they always referred to the archaeologists as people who were an important part of the process in the script, and that's not always been the case. Sometimes archaeologists and metal detectorists have been opposed and angry with each other, but on that programme there was this very subtle discourse that was kind of helping to direct people in the right direction. We've been accused of being bunny huggers, as really anyone who's involved with the environment tends to be accused from time to time. It's this old argument that archaeology gets in the way. Often people say, oh, well, this archaeology, it's all there, it's stopping us creating jobs. This kind of preserving these ancient sites. Well, what about the archaeologists' jobs? Are they not important too? And so there was a debate on the radio about that. Ironically, the local councillor who said that on national radio, represented the area in Cambridgeshire where a site called Must Farm was discovered. Now, if you've heard of Must Farm, it's been described as England's prehistoric Pompeii. It's the most amazingly well-preserved Bronze Age site in the Fens, with superb house structures, preservation of organic textiles, and you name it. It really is a phenomenal site. And this was a stunning discovery. And I think Must Farm probably the best archaeological excavation in terms of the quality of preservation we've had in the last few years in England. It's ironic that dispute arose in that very area. Occasionally some people see us as interfering with the rest of the sacred dead, and we get accused of that. A friend of mine was almost punched on a dig in London where he was digging some Roman skeletons ahead of a crossrail development by a guy who was from the construction team. And he said, how dare you dig up these dead people? They were buried here for a reason. He said, well, if I didn't do it, then you would with your JCB. Oh, hadn't thought of that, So we treat the human remains with great respect. There's a lot of guidance, a lot of protocol about doing that. But ultimately, we have a process whereby we can use excavations of where they have to occur of dead people to tell us an enormous amount about the past. This is where things like isotopes come in. We can map the place of origin of people who have been dead a long time by taking chemical signals out of their teeth, and they relate to geological areas, and we can tell if someone's native to that particular place where they were buried or not. Ancient DNA is now coming up very strongly in our map of techniques. And I think archaeology has now become, a little bit more professionalised in the sense that we actually do kind of try and meet the engineers and the architects halfway in terms of the way we present ourselves. We're not all weirdos, but there are a few around, and long may they reign, I think. They usually have the most interesting, unusual ideas that we take in. So this is, I put this on really not because I want to talk about Avebury or Silbury Hill, which are enormously interesting. And we do quite a bit of teaching in our courses about these amazing sites. We take people out to Avebury as part of the certificate in archaeology. But this is an example of an excavation. This is what archaeologists should be seen to do, I think. And you can see it's a square hole, very carefully measured out. There's a certain procedure to excavation. We like to be very exact about the way that we approach it. You'll see there are measuring tapes. This is part of a surveying instrument, and people are digging the features. These are the ancient ditches and pits in this area in a systematic way, and they're recording them systematically. For instance, this ditch here, they haven't just ripped everything out of the ditch in the desperate hope of finding something. What they've done is they've put a section through it, and they've dug a vertical face so those layers in the ditch can be understood and recorded. This guy over here is drawing on a plan the material that he can see. This is carefully measured. So we have a permanent record of what was here. Of course, that's filtered through his eyes and through his hands. So, we have photography and other techniques, increasingly using drones now to take joined up pictures of excavations to try and produce a permanent record. And the whole sort of digital and other forms of archiving are a big part of the archaeological process. And this is a tiny little slot, this excavation. There's a huge landscape around it. In the distance there's that enormously interesting and simply enormous prehistoric monument. Does anyone know about Silbury Hill? Have you been there? Yeah. It's, well, you're not really supposed to go up it. Yeah, there was a path up there at one stage, but it's very, very fragile on top. So I think people who go up now are being a bit naughty. But it is a stunning monument. We now know it's not the only one. There's another mound similar to that that's been found nearby in the grounds of Marlborough School, which had long been thought to have been a Tudor garden mound, but actually is prehistoric. Not as big as Silbury. And it was created in the early Bronze Age, and then it was used in every period since. So these monuments have a life that continues, and that's an important point to make. We don't just see something as being fixed on the time it was created. Most structures that we study have been changed and have evolved over time. And of course, there's a very great archaeological story attached to Silbury Hill, going back to the 18th century, where it was considered it must be a burial mound and there must be a fabulously rich burial at the heart of it, full of gold. So various mining shafts were dug into it. Most recently in the 1960s, actually, where the BBC paid for one to be dug, and these have all undermined it, and it was in danger of collapse. But a very clever and very high-tech solution was found to restore that. And the conservation side of archaeology, that's the point I'm trying to make, is also very important, stabilising and managing these structures. So what is the academic subject of archaeology about? We've had a look at some of the things that archaeologists do and some of the views that the public have of archaeology. So it's really based on the study of the human past. So I've put a big cross there over the dinosaur, just so that you don't go away under any misapprehension. Humans and dinosaurs never coexisted. Whatever you've seen on television or in American museums, who studies dinosaurs, if not an archaeologist? Paleontologists, correct. We like paleontologists, they're wonderful people. They have a slightly different museum to us in Oxford, in the Natural History Museum, and long may they reign, but they aren't archaeologists and we aren't paleontologists. So we're really studying how humans have changed the world since the human impact began, initially in Africa, obviously with early humans, but really spreading out across the world. And of course archaeology comes up to the present day. It doesn't stop at some point. Prehistoric archaeology is the archaeology of times before which there was any written record. And of course that does vary around the world. And then that merges into historical archaeology, where written records and material remains are studied alongside each other. They often give very interesting different impressions of the past, actually, through to the present day. And there is an archaeology of the present day. There's an archaeology of the materiality of the present day, how we live today, and that helps us understand how we lived in the past. It's a magpie subject. It pulls in bits of lots of other subjects. So if your personal interest is quite artistic and you're perhaps into poetry or something like that, or painting watercolours, then that's great, because there's a place for you in archaeology. On the other hand, if you like nothing better than advanced mathematics and computing or chemistry or whatever, that comes in as well. We use a whole range of approaches and techniques, but it kind of sews itself together in the common quest of trying to understand and to represent in an intelligible way what happened in the distant past. is it an art or is it science? Well, it certainly uses scientific techniques, but ultimately I think it is a humanistic subject. It's an ideas-based subject. We're not looking for laws of physics, such as may be found in a laboratory. We might use those laws to help us get to where we want to be, but really what we're into is discussing and debating the past. This guy here is probably the leading archaeologist of the early days of archaeology, the great-grandfather, if you like, of modern archaeology, General Pitt Rivers, who was the first inspector of ancient monuments, the first government officer that had responsibility for archaeology under the first Ancient Monuments Act that was carried through Parliament in 1882. Very, very limited provisions, but that has developed into all the protections that we have today. And a towering figure, as you can obviously sense from the portrait, probably didn't suffer fools gladly, but nonetheless made an enormous contribution in lots of different ways. He was a one-man kind of innovator, really, and of course there are lots of famous and important women in the history of archaeology as well, but I think a lot of the strands of what we study today come from Pitt Rivers' work in the 19th century. He had the advantage of not having to need a job, really. He was an heir to a landed fortune in Dorset, which is one reason he was able to do archaeology. He did it on his own land. So unlike most of us, he didn't have to go and beg and plead with the landowner. He just looked in the mirror and gave himself permission. But, of course, he bequeathed his enormously important ethnographic collection from all around the world to Oxford University, which is now the amazing Pitt Rivers Museum. So there's a multiplicity of evidence, which I don't want to bore you with at this point, but these are all the things that we look at in the way we teach archaeology. It's not just about digging. There's a vast amount of evidence and approaches and ideas beyond that. The landscape can be brought together through all kinds of aerial and ground survey. Excavation tends to follow that, really, because we look for points of interest in a bigger picture to excavate. And then, of course, there's the panoply of dating and other analytic techniques. I've mentioned isotopes, chemical analysis. I also mentioned ancient healthcare, the correct word for which is paleopathology. That's where we diagnose the kind of diseases that people we've had in the past and create a picture of the health of different societies. And there's the world of historical archives. Even a relatively recent historical source can tell us stuff about the distant past. I've looked at relatively recent maps from the 19th century that have got field names on that say things like the bumps. Well, what would that indicate? Bump? Yeah, barrows or burial mounds, Roman field, those kind of things. You pick them up from more recent sources and they take you back to where you want to be. And of course, a huge amount of our research is not just going out there and finding new evidence, but working on evidence that other people have found but really not made the most of. Museums are packed full of material that is desperately waiting for people to go and study it. And here's a few pictures of those kinds of things, really. This is a 3D model of a landscape with an important site in the middle, such as, perhaps one of the great citadels of Central America. There's somebody working in an archive. Those boxes are familiar sights to archaeologists the world over. Just because something's been taken out of the ground and the fun and uproar of excavation is over, really that's when the real work actually begins. And you've got years ahead of you, in some cases, of intensive study. What's this? Anyone like to hazard a guess? Yeah, it's an aerial photograph, correct. It's a rather old aerial photograph taken by a guy called Major Allen, who's an Oxfordshire flyer. It's of crop marks near Dorchester-on-Thames. These have all gone now. It's part of a gravel quarry, but we have the record of them. What's this? It's a harder one to guess, this. It's a peat core, correct. It's a core taken out of a peat bog, which gives us a layered history going right back. Peat core. Yes, you know what peat is? Yeah, it's like a mushy, solid vegetable mass of earth which accumulates in the bottom of watercourses, really. This is an aerial view of a big excavation with a lot of features showing, and that's an individual feature. Anyone get their eye on that? Can you work out what that is?
A lock. A lock? Padlock?
What, that thing there?
Yeah, I'm thinking of very close.
No, it's actually a pit. It's an Iron Age pit that's half of which has been dug, and you can see the edge of it here, and there are the layers inside. And of course those layers would then be taken away, sampled, the soil will be sifted, often using a wet sieve, and lots of seeds and other material would come out of them, including stuff like this, and I'd be very surprised if anyone guessed what that is.
It's a bit of it's bone.
It's bone, yeah?
A little like
whale.
Now look at the scale, that's centimetres, okay? You're not that far off actually. Fishbone. It's a fishbone. Because we're interested in people's diet, how they exploited their environment over the time. This stuff tells us an enormous amount. Of course, once you've got the data from one site, one excavation, you then go up a level and compare it and analyse it in relation to all the others which have produced evidence of a similar nature. So the end product is not, essentially, we're not closing down questions in archaeology, we're opening them up. We're not saying, okay, we know what that is, forget about it, that box is ticked, move on to the next thing. Really, the point of the, yes, we create new information all the time, and it's very stimulating and exciting, but it's all about debating that evidence. Archaeologists love to lock horns in debate and really get some cut and thrust going, and we like our students to sort of have a go at that a little bit for themselves, to create a reasoned argument for something. The questions we put forward in assignments are not simply to be answered as a yes or no, or as a factual answer. Like, how many hill forts are there in Wales? Well, I don't know the answer to that actually. Somebody probably does, because there's an atlas that's been recently created. Let's say 235. Well, that would be the answer, wouldn't it? So we don't ask questions like that. We ask questions like, you know, to what extent are the hill forts of Wales comparable to those in other parts of the UK? And then you've got a much broader question and a much more interesting way into the topic. And there's very often, you know, right answers and wrong answers operate at a certain level, and they do exist. But above that is the whole quest for ideas and interpretation. Coming back now to the more ethical side of archaeology, this a few years old now, this leaflet, but it did rather put me on the spot, because yes, of course, like everybody else, I don't like to see green fields being eaten up for housing development. In fact, I'm currently rather bothered about this great big road that's being planned around Oxford, which looks like it might go quite close to my house and might spoil some rather beautiful countryside near Shotover and Horsepath, that area. But at the time, in 2009, I was actually living in a house which is very similar to some of these. And I thought, actually, that puts me in an awkward position, doesn't it? And most archaeologists who work in the professional side of archaeology, anyone heard of Oxford Archaeology? Yeah, that's a big organisation based in Oasley Mead, which we work very closely with in this department to deliver education and training. And they're the biggest professional practice of archaeology in England, and they work a lot for things like HS2 and so forth. And of course, to have a job, something needs to change. If everything stayed the same, we'd all be out of a job. So this whole process of change, yes, we can influence it. Certain aspects of it are something which we would oppose, but not everything. You know, it's a much more mixed picture than a black and white. And some people, however the Stonehenge road goes, some people are going to get a job out of that, Others will be absolutely horrified and lament the destruction of that amazing landscape. And I don't really know actually where I stand on that, to be honest, because I can see both sides of the argument. There's also the whole business of making archaeology and conserving archaeology when it's in danger, and it can be in danger from overpopularity as well. This is somewhere where I've done a lot of work myself, up in Orkney. I had a major field project which was published earlier this year actually. Just been doing a few book launches recently. And it was on the same bay as Silbury. Heard of Silbury? Well, it's a Neolithic village in which the houses are amazingly well preserved. They're made out of stone and they stand really to their full height. They were buried under a sand dune, which was then destroyed by a storm. And this is now heavily over-touristed because a lot of cruise ships come into the port at Kirkwall, which is the capital of the Orkney Islands, and then these people are bussed over and they walk around Silbury, which is an extremely fragile site. It's just sand, really. They tramp around on this little tiny walkway and they go back to the shop and they buy their whatever they buy in the shop and get back on the coach and go back to the cruise ship. They don't even spend any money really, apart from in the shop at Silbury. Yet it's a good thing that archaeology is being made open and available to such a diverse and broad audience. But on the downside, they're causing a lot of damage at some of these monuments. And what can we do to save them, really? And that is a big question to which, again, the answer is complex. Where are we? And the ethical side of archaeology really extends in all directions. Here are some images which you'll probably have picked up on in recent years. I went to Palmyra in the 1990s actually and was amazed at what a stunning place it was. So I was absolutely heartbroken when this happened, this destruction. And of course yet more destruction has happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. We currently have a project where we're trying to map all this using aerial remote sensing to try and get a handle on what's going on in places actually too dangerous for Western archaeologists to go. In Britain, of course, we've had slightly less upsetting, perhaps more interesting controversies. The famous Richard III burial in the car park in Leicester. Well, that's an example. We say, what is the point of archaeology? Anything to do with Leicester now, which is a fine place, you know, always mentions Richard III. The tourist board have got Richard III right up there to come and visit Leicester. And it's become a big part of Leicester's kind of presentation of itself to the world. And I'm not trying to be unpleasant about Leicester, but it perhaps lacks some of the kind of tourist attractions that you might find in York or something like that, doesn't it? But they're trying to get people in, and I think it's really good actually. They've really made a hit on this, and it's archaeology that's helped them do that. So anyone who tells you that archaeology doesn't create jobs and gets in the way of things, tell them to go to Leicester and see what archaeology has done for them. And of course, cities around the country are enormously interesting three-dimensional puzzles, which archaeologists love to try and fit together the components. This is where archaeology is at its most complex. It's a really interesting building in, actually not a city, but more of a rural town in Devizes. You can see this rather ordinary Victorian shop front, but at the side you can see that amazing medieval structure that's had the Victorian bit clamped on the front. So that slide, I like to use that to say, what you see is not what you always get with archaeology. Don't go on first impressions, look beyond them. And here at Oxford Castle now, a hotel, but that was a really complex excavation done by Oxford Archaeology. This is the most complex stuff that you could possibly imagine archaeologists tackling, but a huge amount of evidence. And it proved, which I was really happy about, that Oxford Castle does genuinely have Anglo-Saxon origins, and that the great square tower on the corner of St George's almost certainly predates the Norman conquest, which was really great for Oxford. And drawing the community in, I think, is, I'm returning to this point because I think it's so crucial. This was our project that we had at the leper hospital I just mentioned earlier on in East Oxford at Bartlemas. Beautiful place, go and have a look. It's very quiet up there. But we got people from all over the community, certainly not the kinds of people that would perhaps traditionally flock to archaeology, the educated and the sort of interested amateurs. There were often people coming here whose English wasn't great, who perhaps were hadn't got much of an educational background. We had some guys from a school where they'd been sent because they'd done naughty things, and they came with a guy who sort of oversaw them. But they were wonderful. You could see them, the light coming on, the light bulb coming on when they were digging, and it does have that effect. And the project won a big award, our community project, and it attracted nearly 800 volunteers from the community over 5 years, which I think is a fair number for a project of that size. And the end of an archaeological education, you can just drift off and do something else if you want to, but a lot of people choose to practice archaeology, and here are some of the ways in which it can be done, some of which involve having a full-time job, and other aspects are voluntary or part-time or part of a group or something. And it's really great to be able to do something with the knowledge that you've accumulated and meet people who are interested and carry on spreading the message. I think I've done all of these at some point. I think most archaeologists will have done at least most of them during their careers. There's probably other definitions I could have put on that as well. So what do we do here? I'm going to finish in a minute, but I'd just like to invite you to consider the courses that we run in the department. We have a stack of courses, which I'm sure you're all aware of already, of the general types of course that we run. Weekly classes and weekend schools, things that you can just sign up to, come along to, have an interesting weekend, and there's nothing more to it than that, really. There are online courses, which are, you can do that from anywhere, but you produce written work for those, and that's graded and assessed, and you get feedback. And then, of course, we have a series of awards. I explained why we used that word earlier. Qualifications, certificate. I'd like to draw your attention to the undergraduate certificate in archaeology, which is really for entry level for anyone who's interested in archaeology. And there's some leaflets here. There's also another big stack in the reception area. It's a 2-year course, taught partly in the evenings and partly at weekends, and has a lot of practical components. You asking a question?
Yeah, you mentioned McAston and the newer generation of archaeologists. Where does someone from Wheeler figure in?
Oh, well, I'm glad you mentioned him. Wheeler was, I should have put a photo of him in actually. He was this towering figure of the mid-20th century. He was one of the first television archaeologists. He was on animal, vegetable and mineral. And I never met him. I'm not old enough to have known him, but people who are a bit older than me did. And he was a force of nature, apparently. Had a moustache and was a very military type guy.
But wasn't he the one who started trenches and things like that?
Well, he didn't start trenches, but he developed it. He didn't start the idea of trenches, but he developed it into his own system, which was very popular for a while. He was a disciple of Pitt Rivers, really. He was the next generation after that. Let me just get back to these awards and things. So, certificate, and then slightly higher up the diploma, advanced diploma, and then we have a master's degree, part-time in landscape archaeology, and if you're really up for it, then we have a part-time doctoral programme in archaeology taught. It's a fully fledged Oxford University degree and programme in every way, but it's taught through the medium of part-time studies in this department. And it encompasses landscape as well as other forms of archaeology.
How much is possible to do online?
Well, there's a good selection of online courses. They don't extend beyond a certain level in terms of qualification. You can't do an online DPhil, for instance. In fact, Oxford said it won't do online DPhils. It's more of the entry level. We are governed by what the university will and will not permit, and they've got quite rigid ideas in some ways, but we're constantly trying to change and innovate there.
My problem is I live in France, and I've already done the archaeology online courses there, and I'm wondering how to go sort of from there.
Well, I think Leicester have a programme where you can do a master's online, but Oxford doesn't, so you could look at that. Much as I hate to advertise the opposition. I'm going to finish in a sec, but these are the kind of, got to finish by 5 to, actually my watch still says 10 to 4, but that clock's a bit nearer to 5 to. Some of the things that our students have done over the years, and this is not, it's not just bookwork and library work, that's a big part of it, but practical encounters with the outdoor side of archaeology I think are really important. And there's something in this for everybody. You don't have to be an athlete to do archaeology. We can arrange stuff for people with more limited physical means to work on. I mean, there's always the sort of workshopy type stuff, looking at finds, cataloguing, studying them. There's digging, but as I've said before, that's not always the be-all and end-all of archaeology. This was at Dorchester-on-Thames, Roman town in the Thames Valley, and learning how to use the equipment that we have for measuring and recording in the landscape. It's a really stimulating way to teach, actually. People get really into the hands-on stuff, I think, as well as the book learning and the writing. It all goes together. You can't really have one without the other. And that's the last slide, but when contemplating the greats of archaeology, and this is a sort of random list really, it's easy to be overawed by their achievement and by their great status, but they all had to start somewhere, didn't they? Just like I did, and just like you might do if you are minded to do so. And it's an honourable thing to be a beginner in something, because from then the only way forward is upwards and into greater knowledge and understanding and inspiration, really. So if you've got any questions, I'm happy to take them. Thank you.